Early in the morning, in the morning, in the morning.
Yeah, true. I could just talk about jail stories or something like that. Yeah, whatever. That's absolutely fine. So cool. Let's do that then. That's not a problem. So cool. Where do we start then, my friend? Where do we start? Where do we start this? Because I mean, first things first. Whatever, like Tim Westwood in general. What's your viewpoint and where do you stand on the news that broke? First things first.
Well, I've always thought that Tim Westwood is quite an odd character. Yeah, so I've been to hip hop for a long time. Obviously, I've heard him on the radio. One thing that I found odd about him is like him putting on this really weird kind of persona, black accent. Yeah. It's almost like he thinks he's something that he's not. And I don't really know where that comes from. Like there is a mystique around hip hop, and there's this like culture of rappers being, you know, really famous, being possibly misogynistic. But I think most people that listen to rap, myself included, know that that's, you know, that's not, you don't act like that in real life.
Yeah.
And I think that Tim Westwood actually thinks he's a superstar DJ, and I think that it's really gone to his head. So the reason I'm mentioning all this, I think he's very, very entitled. So it's not surprising for me to hear these kind of accusations. And the other thing, I think I mentioned this in an email to you, is that I saw him once. It was a long time ago in a Busta Rhymes gig, and the stuff he was saying on the mic was just so cringe. I mean, it was literally stuff like, if you've got guns, put them up in the air, bang, bang, bang. And if you're a girl, wave that booty, show me your pussy and stuff like that. and like the first couple of times, I thought he was joking. Like I thought he was just playing around, but he kept doing it throughout the entire gig. And I was like, there's something very strange about this guy. What do you make of him as a personality?
So again, similarly to you, I completely agree. I think he's a bit of a caricature, almost like a stereotype. Now, I've personally, as I told you before we start recording this, I've now got beef with Tim Westwood. So I'm really going to try not to cuss him out here. Just try and you know, talk about this, analyze this from a kind of neutral, analytical, articulate standpoint. But I agree. I think he plays into this kind of stereotype, caricature, what he thinks black people should sound like or whatever. And now, don't get me wrong, like, yeah, black people use a lot of slang, a lot of lingo. So they, you know, talking black and what that actually means and things like that. You know, there's obviously, we know that there's certain lingo and things that you know, people of the black community use, and he does seem to play into that a lot more. I think I completely agree with the entitlement. Listen, he is a DJ in the 90s. You know, there was no other access to music and new music at the time outside of DJs, you know what I'm saying? They were kind of God in the scene, you know, whether you go to a club, when you're on a radio, his name was absolutely ringing off back in the day. You know, I used to have albums of his in the noughties, you know, his tapes, his, what do you call them, kind of compilation tapes of all the bangers, mixtapes, like Fat Joe. I think Lean Back was on one of his tapes, but I think he's an absolute joke, to be honest. And I believe everything that has come out, because I've seen it with my own eyes, the way he moves at university raves. I even came across him in Ayia Napa on my 18th, you know, them first lads holidays, nearly 10 years ago, pretty much. He was there roaming the streets at 4 or 5 a.m. He's a creep, man. I'm sorry, he is. It is what it is. He's just a weirdo. And the fact that he's integrating himself in certain kind of circles at 65, 70 years old, talking to 20-year-old women is just, yes, they're legal. Yes, they're over 18 or over 16, whatever the age of consent is. But it's come on.
It's just creepy, isn't it?
Come on. Yeah, I don't care if it's legal. It's weird, man.
You definitely get the impression that he's trying to portray a certain image. Because as you say, he's in his 60s now, right? Even when he was in his 50s, he was acting and dressing like he was much, much younger. You know, if I'm, correct me if I'm wrong, but his dad's like a preacher.
Literally a bishop or something like that. Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I'm not saying you can't have a voice in hip hop because you come from a certain background. I'm not saying that. But when you present yourself as something that you're not, then that's really weird. And I wonder if his experiences have kind of added to his narcissism. So the fact that he was, you know, this gatekeeper to hip hop a few decades ago, I wonder if he just felt it just added to his sense of entitlement. Everybody around him was gassing him up. Everybody loved him. Everyone was giving him props. I'm sure that men and women probably sucked up to him just because they wanted their foot into the music industry. So I wonder if over time he kind of lost perspective and just thought of himself as this god, and therefore was entitled to sex with whoever he wanted.
It's the entitlement coupled with his fetishization of black women, though. It's the fact that he specifically targets black women that combined with his entitlement has equaled where we are now, pretty much, and him abusing his power to. Now, don't get me wrong. Of course, I understand both sides. A lot of people who are kind of inherently misogynistic will be like, "Oh, well, these women just wanted a leg up. They wanted to rah rah rah." But I don't think people understand the power dynamics. And I'm actually glad that we're having this conversation, because you and your background, your experience, your actual knowledge of the psychology and things like that, I would love for you to actually explain to people how, like, really how the power dynamic works. You know, when you've got someone who is in a position of power, a male as well, a white male, and you've got different women who are younger, who are, you know, they're easily exploited. And that is a real thing. I think people who are kind of sexist in general don't understand that it's not always women just wanting to, I don't know, love a bit of clout. It's them kind of, I suppose, from my perspective, living in a patriarchal world, for example, or, you know, almost in a sense being second-class citizens in different ways. Yeah, women do have a lot of benefits in a lot of different ways. I'm not going to say they don't, but in other ways they don't as well. So yeah, I would definitely like to hear your take on kind of how men, or usually men, abuse their power when it comes to women and things like that.
Sure. I'm not sure if I can say it much better than you already have done. I'll give it a shot. So I think the thing is that when you're looking at most industries, especially in the entertainment industry, it is really hard to break through. Like, you know, you and I are both YouTubers. I'm sure you've had the experience that I've had of reaching out to people, obviously getting ignored, just doing what you think are going to be big videos, and they don't really come to anything. So the point I'm trying to make is, it is a graft. It is really hard to get in. There is no easy way in. Like, you know, I trained as a doctor. There's an easy way in. Once you get into medical school, there's a path. Whereas for everybody, women and men, it's really hard in the entertainment industry. So if you get an opportunity to speak to somebody like Tim Westwood, then you're going to take it, aren't you? If you're a young man or woman, but then you're going to try and use that as a way of building a relationship to get in. That doesn't in any way mean that sex or sexual gratification should be expected or implied. And I think the very fact that, from what I've read, most of the women felt that his advances were completely unexpected. So it wasn't like there was a bit of flirtation and the evening kind of progressed and they may have led him on, or he might have perceived that they led him on, and then, you know, he tried to make a move and then got it wrong. I don't think that's the picture at all. You get the picture of somebody who expects sex right from the beginning. You know, he just suddenly pounces on his woman. I should say allegedly. I think we need to say allegedly. Allegedly. He has denied these stories, but the very fact there's so many stories and they're all very similar, and the women don't know each other, in my mind, you know, adds to a guilty look. But yeah, so I think that, you said this yourself, Cameron, I think that the women in those situations would have just thought that this is an opportunity to get to know somebody that might be able to help me. And I think he even allegedly said to some of these women that, you know, I can help you make a mixtape, or I can record a session in the studio with you. And so they're in this mindset. Remember, they're quite young, probably quite naive. Very young. One of them was 19. I don't know if some of them were even younger than that.
70, I think another one was 17, 19, 21, all that. Yeah, gross.
So how's a 17-year-old girl going to know what to expect, what not to expect? So, and the other thing is that I think it's quite easy when you're distanced from it, especially temporally, in terms of the fact that it happened many decades ago, you don't realize how much of a shock, how blindsided these women would have been at the time. So it's not as if like Tim Westwood makes a move and then you have, you know, half minutes or half an hour to decide what to do. You have to make your mind up there and then. And whereas it's easy to say that I would turn around and punch him in the face, I think in reality, a lot of people just freeze. So they freeze because they don't know what to do. And he, either intentionally or unintentionally, sees that them freezing as them not saying no, so they're not rejecting him, so he kind of assumes that is consent, and so they carry on. So I think it is easy to criticize them and to say, well, I wouldn't have let that happen, but in reality, when you're in that moment, I think they don't know what's going on. Plus, probably they're trying to wonder in their mind, they're trying to decide in their mind whether not going along with him would damage their potential opportunities. Exactly. Just like he's a gateway in, he's also, you know, a potential shut door to damage you. And especially back in those days where you didn't have social media, YouTube, where you couldn't promote yourself in many other ways. If you get blackballed by somebody who doesn't like you or spreads rumors or lies about you, then that's basically the end of your dreams. So I think he very much used that opportunity in his position of power to exploit these women. And we see it all the time, don't we? We see it in Jimmy Savile is a really good example of somebody that did that repeatedly over and over again over decades. Epstein,
anyone. Epstein. That's why Tim, his new nickname now is Timmy Savile. So that's what we're going to put now. Timmy Savile, that's it. So Timmy Savile, he's earned that nickname. But have you, in your like experience then, when you look at different Oh my God. You see these Apple Watches, they're always listening, man. So Siri's just always listening. But in your experience, you know, working with criminals, ex-offenders, whoever, and psychology in general, does someone like Timmy Savile, for example, does someone like Tim fit the profile or have similar traits as a traditional kind of, not traditional, I mean, different predators, they come in different shapes and sizes, different forms, but as in, like, do you see traits in him from the stories that you can also see in other people as well, or convicted and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think demographically, aside from being male, he's quite different from your average demographic of somebody who's a sexual predator, just purely because of his age. But the one thing you do see, and we've already talked about, is the abuse of power and the abuse of their situation. So in offenders that I've seen, there's often a power dynamic in their victims. So straight away things comes to mind is I've seen many sort of quite successful or quite high level drug dealers who exploit women, and they do that by getting the women either addicted to drugs or getting in massive debts, and then they feel like they've got no choice but to kind of give consent or go along sexually with what the perpetrators want to do. Sometimes I've even assessed family members who've sexually abused their own sort of younger female relatives. And again, it's all about power. It's all about them being in a position where it's really hard for the person to say no. I suppose the one thing that's slightly different about Timmy Savile, if we're calling him that, compared to most other perpetrators, is that usually there's a form of grooming. So usually it's not the perpetrators that I see, they don't just sort of sexually pounce on somebody the first time they meet them. They make them desensitized to them, and there's different ways of doing that. They either just hang out with them in a non-sexualized way, or become friends with their parents.
Comfortable,
For example, school teachers. And in fact, another case that springs to mind is, you know, that Zara Phythian, so the Doctor Strange actress.
Yes. They've been abusing that child for years or something, weren't they?
Yeah, exactly. And that again speaks to the power dynamic. So the child was, I believe, 13 when it started, and she was a taekwondo student. So that's just another example of someone that's in a position where they're supposed to be caring for, or looking out after, or looking out for somebody that's younger and more vulnerable. And over time, so it's not usually like a very severe act in the first couple of meetings. It's kind of over time flirting with them more, pushing boundaries, pushing physical boundaries, playing with them, wrestling with them, and then eventually kind of convincing them that they've got this special relationship. So to answer to your question, that's the way that Tim Westwood is different, if these stories are true, is that he didn't bother doing all of the grooming. He just went straight for the kill.
It's an interesting one. Now, as I said, I'm always one that believes victims first and foremost. Now, don't get me wrong. There's been some stories that have come out recently. For example, Meg Thee Stallion and Tory Lanez situation, things like that, where I don't believe Meg at all categorically. I believe Tory and things like that. But it's safer in my mind, because the stats don't really lie. It's safer to believe victims. All the thousands of thousands that don't say anything, completely outweigh the one or two that lie type thing. You know what I'm saying? So, but what's your opinion then on the fact that they never actually went to the feds with this? They never went to the police. They decided to go to BBC and kind of destroy the man's reputation that way. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe them. I look at, I'm not an idiot, I'm emotionally intelligent. I see someone like Tim Westwood and I think, this makes sense. You know, I've seen a lot of things in the past, this makes sense. However, what's your opinion on that, where they haven't taken it actually to the police or the courts, and they've just taken it to his ex-employer, BBC?
Yeah. I think the problem, I imagine, for a lot of the victims in taking it to the police is that because it happened quite substantially long ago, it's really hard to make a criminal case. So there almost certainly is not going to be any evidence. It's not going to be, scene stains, DNA, etc., etc. So it is just going to be their word against his. And whereas you need beyond reasonable doubt, so the criminal standard is much higher than what you might have doubt through an employer. So another way of saying that is an employer is much more likely to sack somebody or distance themselves from an employee than it is likely to get a criminal charge. And I think the other thing is that it takes a bit of, if one person comes out, then other victims are going to get confidence from that. So if you think you're the only person that's been abused by an international DJ, 100%. And as far as you know, nobody else has ever made that accusation, then people are not going to believe you, especially if it happened such a long time ago. Whereas if you hear other stories, especially similar stories where the abuse has occurred in almost exactly the same way, taking it back to the flat, etc., then you're going to think, hang on, I'm not the only one. So I think objectively looking at it, you can think, hang on, why have they come out after all this time? Why have they come out together? But to me, it actually makes sense. That
it makes sense. It makes
like dominoes, isn't it? You feel more emboldened that people are going to take you seriously. And we have to acknowledge that it's hard. It's hard for a victim to come out, because not only is there the risk that they might not be believed, but it's also a risk that they will be judged. They will be thought of as, you know, slags, for want of a better word, put themselves in that situation, which I think is completely unfair, but that's how some people in the public will perceive them.
It's interesting because some people, that when they hear that X amount of people have come out against one person, their initial reaction, again, this built-in misogyny or whatever, is again to query and challenge why they've all come at the same time, why it's been so late. And I completely agree with everything you said. I just think it's so interesting how certain men will give these women, they give these women too much credit. They think that these women have just collated in some group chat and say, you know what, let's target Tim Westwood today and make up this story. And that's not, come on, let's use our logic here. That's not really how it's going to happen. It's as simple as one person who's probably a little bit braver than the others have decided to come out. The rest have found some strength within that, and they found their voice too. It's as simple as that. But some people just seem to, I think people disregard the fact that these are victims first and foremost. So, you know, the consequences of going through some trauma like this is for life. Yeah, it's crazy. So like, what type of things have you come across in your experience here of victims of sexual assault, and how it's actually changed their mentality and how it's changed their kind of their whole being, really and truly?
Yeah, good question. So as well as seeing these kinds of victims, you know, females from high-profile celebrities, I've got more experience of dealing with sexual abuse that's occurred when people are children. Okay. So, for example, I can tell you this. I did a series of assessments for a man called John Styler, who I doubt you'd have heard of because he's not particularly that well known in the press, but he was a headmaster who abused young boys in the 70s. And one solicitor's firm that I worked for had heard about this, and a bit like we were saying, when one came out, lots of others came out. This man actually committed suicide, the perpetrator, John Styler, so he couldn't be held responsible. But the assessments that I were doing were for these men, now they're in their 40s and 50s, were sort of suing the school district for not keeping them safe. And the reason I'm bringing all this up is because it was just for obviously it goes without saying that what they experienced was horrible and tragic, but just from a educational psychiatric perspective, what's interesting for me was the range of different psychiatric consequences that these men had. So I assessed about, I think, 7 or 8 different individuals, and the abuse was very, very similar in terms of what this man did, in terms of like making them think they're special, having these special classes in his office and blah blah blah. And at one end of the spectrum, there was one out of the 8 or so men that I assessed who actually wasn't that psychiatrically damaged, to my surprise. He had a relatively fulfilling life, and he, sorry, I'm just getting messages on the screen. Had a relatively fulfilling life, and he was quite sort of stable. But on the other hand, other end of the spectrum, far more common, more of them developed post-traumatic stress disorder. So when you talk about being the victim of a sexual assault, especially when you're so young and vulnerable, by far the most common diagnoses are anxiety and depression. Which kind of makes sense. You'd expect that. And post-traumatic stress disorder. So for your viewers, you might already know this, Cameron, but that's when you relive the experience. So even if it's years, decades later, they either have flashbacks or nightmares about what happened. And flashbacks isn't just like an intrusive memory. I'm sure we've all done things that we regret. You spoke like an asshole at a party because you're and we have memories like this. Is different from that. This is actually being transported back to the time when the abuse is happening. You can actually see the sights, smell the smells, and hear the sounds of when it's happening. So it's a very debilitating illness, and it can be triggered by random reminders of the perpetrator. So in this particular man's case, one of the victims that I saw, when he saw a man that looked like this man, like he had the same facial hair, it would involuntarily trigger these kind of flashbacks.
That's harrowing, really, really harrowing. In my experience, I've definitely had to research what CPTSD, what that meant. When I came across complex PTSD, that opened my eyes in a lot of regarding a lot of things, and it made sense. Is that something that you've also seen in what in other people that you've worked with? Just again, similar to PTSD. Actually, can you explain to my viewers what CPTSD is and the difference between that and normal PTSD?
Sure, absolutely. So complex PTSD is a bit like it's like PTSD on steroids, basically. So it's for people that instead of having 1 or 2 horrific events, it's where they have a catalogue of abuse or trauma throughout their childhood. So a very common situation might be where they're a victim of sexual abuse with somebody they live with say like a parent figure, as opposed to this man who I was talking about where it just only happened once every few weeks. So it's like a lifetime or a childhood full of trauma, and you get the same kind of symptoms as PTSD. So I forgot to mention them all. So the reliving is one of them. You get what we call hypervigilance, which means that you're constantly on edge and easily startled, and you have like a numbness, an emotional numbness. So that's PTSD. Complex PTSD is all of those things, but you also have extra. So you also have a loss of identity. So you don't really fully ever feel that you belong anywhere. And on top of that, you have these feelings of shame and guilt. And you can have them in PTSD, but they're much more pronounced in complex PTSD. And it can actually change your personality. So I know that sounds a bit extreme, but it's actually true. And I've certainly seen it in people. So with PTSD, you can, if you're high functioning, live a relatively normal life. And then when you get these triggers that I was talking about, you flip into these flashbacks, and maybe a few hours or a day or two afterwards, you feel really rough, really low in your mood. That's PTSD. But with complex PTSD, it's there all the time. It's like you're constantly on, constantly depressed. You feel flat, you feel isolated, you feel withdrawn, you don't particularly want to interact with people. So it's a much more malicious disorder, I'd say.
Have you ever been a therapist as well? Is that something else that you've ever done, like done counselling to any victims of?
No, not really. So there's a lot of misunderstanding between the difference of a psychiatrist and a psychologist. So psychiatrists such as myself, we're medical doctors first, and we kind of deal with the overall treatment of a patient. So we section people if necessary, prescribe medications. But on our team, especially in these like secure units, we'll have a psychologist. So the psychologist doesn't train in all of medicine. They only train in emotions and cognition. So they will sit down with your individual, and they will give like typically a weekly, hourly therapy session. So I've never done it myself.
Okay. That's amazing. What just to quickly change the topic real quick, but similar, kind of staying on to you and your channel. What was it that made you want to start the channel, and the history of the channel, and the name, by the way? Because I love my name, Topical Juice, but I love a fact for Soul Minds. I love that. I think that's very clever. I like that name.
I got 2 puns in one sentence.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Because when I first saw it, I thought a Psych 4, and I thought that's amazing. And you said Soul Minds. I thought, okay, yeah, you know what? I like that one. That's good.
With my job, I've always known that people are interested in it. So from everything from meet people at parties to when I'm dropping my kids off at school, and they find out what they do, they have these questions like, who's the craziest person you've seen? What do you think of this mass murder in the newspaper? And so I think it's even more interesting to other people than it is to me, because it becomes quite routine and quite mundane for me, because I do it all the time. So I've always known in the back of my mind that there is like a thirst for people for knowledge about what I do, but I've never really had the time or the inclination to do anything about it. Then lockdown happened, and my work sort of plummeted, and then I just had this free time, and I just thought, if I don't do something about it, then I'm never going to like break into the media. And then the first thing that inspired me, I have to say, Cameron, unfortunately, was misinformation from other channels. So there's so many psychology or sort of pseudo-scientific psychology channels out there, some of them that are really popular, and they just spout bullshit. They don't give professional opinions, in my view. They just kind of, it looks like they Wikipedia or Google cases, and then just kind of repeat it, and they don't speak from experience. What
is that, like Psych 2 now? What about them? Is that what it's called? Have you heard of them?
I've not heard of Psych 2. I've heard of 𝐶𝐸2Go.
𝐶𝐸2Go, sorry, that's it. 𝐶𝐸2Go. Are they one of the...
I've been a guest on their channel, so...
Okay, good. I was going to say, because I actually subscribed to them. I thought you were about to say that they're one of the ones that do misinformation. I thought their information was good, but I don't know. I could be wrong, innit? I could be wrong.
If you want me to throw shade, then I will mention a name. So there's a guy called Dr. Grande. I've made beef videos about. I'll send you one after this.
Dr. Grande.
He's got a million subscribers, right? And I've made a couple of disc videos about him on my channel, and my issue with him is exactly this. He calls himself Dr. Grande, and his channel's called Dr. Grande, but he's got a PhD in counselor education. But all of his videos are not about counselor education. They're about what I do, basically, the psychological breakdown of high-profile cases. So I think it's misleading to call himself that, but not explain that he's a PhD, not a medical doctor or a psychiatrist. And just to be clear, I said this in my videos, I've got no problem with anybody. I don't own YouTube. I'm not entitled enough to think that I'm in charge. I don't have any problem with anybody making the videos. but I think it's misleading for him to call himself that and not say, by the way, you know, I'm not a doctor in what I'm about to tell you about.
I agree.
And what's quite interesting is when I made these videos, I expected to get a massive backlash because he's got 1 million subscribers. And I did get some backlash, and even to this day, I get some sort of snarky comments, which is fine, you know, I can take that. But more interestingly, loads of people have commented on my video saying, I assumed he was a psychiatrist. I assumed he was a psychologist.
There you go then.
I think kind of proves my point.
That's interesting. So what? So then that's what then stemmed you wanting to then start your own channel and just dispel all these kind of fake ass people out there, basically.
Exactly. So I saw a couple of his videos and I was like, this is not true. This is bullshit. Like, for example, he diagnosed somebody with being a psychopath and he didn't have a basic understanding of what a psychopath is or how you diagnose it. And I was just like, this is just not true. And you know, it's just misleading. People might click on these videos and think they learned something about psychoanalysis or psychopathy. And I just wanted to be a voice that actually speaks from clinical experience.
Perfect. Well, so I can see that this thing's got less than a minute. So what I might do is we could wrap up the video here in like 30 seconds or so, and then just start another one. Is that cool?
That's cool with me.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, like, listen, if you're not watching from my channel, from Topical Juice, please subscribe to my buddy here, A Psych for Sore Minds, which is one of the most amazing channels I've ever heard of, to be fair. And I'm definitely got a new supporter in myself. I'm going to leave all your socials in my description personally as well. And if you're watching from your channel, obviously it's your boy Topical Juice. Check out Topical Juice in the description below, all of that. And yeah, man.
Just to add to that to my viewers, I got in touch with you because I saw your original Tim Westwood video. I really liked it. I thought you spoke really eloquently. You pulled out all the issues, and so I definitely encourage my viewers to go check you out as well.
I appreciate you, man. Well, that's amazing. Fantastic. We can start this recording then, shall we?
All right.
Peace.